Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Flynn, Senior Director of Global Outreach at the Kenneth C. Griffin Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And on behalf of Harvard Griffin GSAS, I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar on writing as an academic for a popular audience. And I'm especially thrilled to introduce our guest speaker today, Emily Oster, who received her PhD from GSAS in 2009 in economics, and among her many roles is Professor of Economics at Brown. Emily has described herself as being on a mission to empower parents by providing data and tools they need to make confident decisions. As a mom of two, she was inspired by her own pregnancy and the lack of clear information to guide her decisions, from prenatal testing to induction. She decided to use her economics background to review and analyze the data on pregnancy and parenting and write a book to help other parents navigate these topics. In addition to being a professor at Brown, Emily is the founder and CEO of Parent Data, which provides parents with high-quality data they can trust. Parent Data's weekly newsletter now has hundreds of thousands of subscribers, along with a strong social media community. Emily is also a New York Times bestselling author whose books include Expecting Better, Crib Sheet, and The Family Firm. Her next book, The Unexpected, will hit shelves on April 2024. Emily, we are so grateful to you for joining us today to share your journey and expertise in writing as an academic for a popular audience. Thank you so much for being with us.
No, thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for coming and listening.
Yeah. Before we begin our conversation, I want to say thank you to those who submitted questions in advance to jumpstart our discussion today. For those in the audience who want to submit a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, which has been disabled. So Emily and Monica and I can chat questions back to each other. My wonderful colleague Monica will be checking the Q&A, aggregating questions by theme, and then sending them to me to weave into our conversation. So let's jump right in. Emily, academics typically write for a scholarly audience. What was your motivation to transition to writing primarily for a non-academic audience? Was it your own pregnancy and the lack of clear information to guide your decisions, or was there some other motivation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two answers to that. So one is the answer to why did I write Expecting Better, which is now a decade old. And the answer to that, I think, is pretty simple, which is that I got pregnant. I found myself very frustrated by the experience of that and by the information I was getting. And I found myself using my tools, my academic tools in sort of navigating my own pregnancy. And then I started writing, and the book sort of like, sometimes I'll just say it like kind of like vomited as like I had to like put this out. It felt like it just important to me. It's the book that I wanted. But if the question were framed as like when did you decide to do this as like most of what you do, that's actually like a later point. So I wrote Expecting Better. It came out, and I didn't particularly think that would mean, okay, I'm doing this as like a big component of my job now. Time passed. I moved to a different professor job. And at some point I made a more conscious decision to write a second book, to write Crib Sheet, which is about parenting and like parenting little kids and breastfeeding and those kind of things. And that was a moment when I sort of said, okay, now I'm going to transition to doing this more and sort of see where that goes. And that got sort of bigger and bigger over time. There was a third book, and now there's a newsletter. And so now it's become a much bigger thing. But that was really the sort of decision to write Crib Sheet was really a pivotal moment in thinking, I'm going to try to make a go of this as a bigger part of my professional identity.
So how did you train yourself in the craft of writing for a general audience? And what would you recommend an academic learn, about how to transition their writing to a lay audience?
So writing for a lay audience is in some ways a lot like teaching. I think it's like has a similar feel, at least the stuff that I do has a similar feel, in that you are trying to help people understand who don't have the technical background that you have if you're talking to your colleagues. And there's a few sort of things that I would pull out as like really important. So one is jargon. So as academics, with other people in our fields, we use a lot of jargon, and we use it for good reason, because it's shorthand. Because like when I say, well, don't price on the, like, obviously we shouldn't be pricing on the inelastic portion of the demand curve. like people who are in economics are like, yeah, of course, and people in other academic fields are like, what are you talking about? And people out in the world, like when I say that to my team, they're just like, what? And so some of sort of transitioning your writing into a more popular audience is about taking out the jargon. And that doesn't always mean being longer. Well, sometimes it can mean being longer. Often it just means thinking like, I would use this word, optimize, elasticity, whatever. Like I would use this word in conversation because that's where my brain is, but other people aren't seeing that word and I got to like take it out of what I do. So I would say a lot of what my editors did on the first book was be like, I don't know what that word means. I don't know what that word means. Why are you using that word? Like, that's not good. So there's a kind of jargon piece. I think the second piece, particularly for the kind of writing I do, which is to try to take academic studies and translate them to an audience, is to try to dial into how you can make people understand the core of why one study is better than another study, or the core of what someone is doing, while accepting they will not understand the details, while accepting that probably it is not your job. You cannot expect to get everyone to the same point that you are in terms of like understanding the literature, which is not true of writing for your peers, where you're hoping that they will kind of see it in exactly the way that you do. And I think that balance is something that I've sort of learned a lot over time. This is also a space where like you do some of it and then you learn, you get some feedback, and you learn, like anything, like you figure it out over time. And I've gotten faster and better over time.
Oh, so just a question that came in kind of previously from the audience is there a difference? Does it depend on whether you're in the sciences, social sciences, or humanities, in terms of how you translate your writing, or are there universal considerations regardless of discipline?
So I think the jargon consideration is universal. So every field has their own jargon and their own way of talking about things that are not like widely shared. So I think that I would say that's true for anyone. I mean, obviously, if you're writing, you're sort of if you're in history and you're sort of taking your second book project is a book project for a popular audience, that's going to require a sort of, that's different than if you're saying like, I'm in chemistry and I'm going to try to like write a book about chemistry for a popular audience, because the sort of the pieces of what you're translating, how much is translation as opposed to kind of storytelling, is a little different. And I guess that's maybe the third piece about this kind of writing, is that you need people to want to read it. And so you need to make it like fun, not fun, you don't need to make it fun, but like you kind of like, you need to grab people. There's this sort of art to grabbing people's interest that is pretty different than most of the way we write academic papers.
So that's such a perfect segue into my next question, which is, academics are used to synthesizing research and making evidence-based arguments. And how did you distill that research expertise in a way that was compelling and easy to understand without watering down the content? How do you, that seems like a fine balance there.
Yeah, I think it's a very fine balance. And I'm sure that if you talk to some people, they would tell you I didn't do it right. But I think, for me, a lot of the process here is to try to get very, very deep down the road myself in what I know about the literature, and how much of the literature I have read, and then figure out what are the conclusions I would draw from this literature, and then figure out what is what are the parts of this literature I want to show people to help them see why I have come to that conclusion. So like a good example is in Crib Sheet, I read about breastfeeding. And when I was sort of doing the research on like, what are the impacts of breastfeeding on outcomes, I had multiple research assistants pull, thousands of papers. I read hundreds and hundreds of papers. I looked at billions, just a huge amount of literature to try to understand what I thought, like what I would conclude about what are the things that were real in the data, what are the things that are not real in the data, where are the biases coming in, how can we understand that? And then when I went to write about it, I didn't say, like, here are the 3,000 papers that say this and the 2,000 papers that say this. I talked about, here's an example. Here's like one in a class of papers, and here are some of the issues with that class of papers. Here's a paper that is better in a class of paper that's better. And this is why I would sort of favor the conclusions out of this class of papers rather than this other class of papers, which is a way to kind of take this enormous literature and get it to where people understand why I've can come to the conclusion that I have without having to actually show them every single citation that one would read there, because that's not feasible.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because I think that's a really important component of translation of academic research into that, because there is so much data out there, and where data comes from matters. So what approaches have you found? Maybe people don't have at their disposal research assistants to do kind of some of this for them, but what approaches can help people sift through the data to help make decisions when there's so much information out there? And how can we understand what is good data, and especially when it involves parenting, when there feels like there's a lot of pressure to get it right and a lot of anxiety about making the wrong choice or a bad choice. So how can you help people sift through those data, all those papers and all those data sets to understand, well, yes, a study can say this, but multiple studies can also show something completely different. And how do you help people evaluate that?
So most of the studies that I read, and most of the studies get coverage in the media, and most of the studies that are published in some sense in this space have more or less the same problem, which is that they are showing correlations and not causal relationships.
Yeah.
So like this is the biggest problem in like social science research writ large, in the space that I kind of exist in, is that there is correlation, but there is not causality. And I spend an enormous amount of time trying to explain to people how you would evaluate whether something seems likely to be causal. And so, one answer to that is like, is it a randomized trial? It's almost never a randomized trial, but if it's a randomized trial, that's good. Then we sort of step down to like a lot of studies in this space are comparing a group that did one thing to a group that did another thing. And then you want to ask, well, is it likely that those groups are otherwise similar? And a sort of simple way to ask that is to say, does it seem likely people are making this choice at random? Right? That their choice of, say, should I let my kid watch 20 minutes of TV a day or 4 hours of TV a day? Does it seem likely that people are just randomly choosing one of those two things and it's unrelated to anything else about them? No, I would argue that doesn't seem likely. And if you sort of subject some of the literature to those kinds of sort of, does this seem random questions, you can often like get a little bit down into understanding, well, why maybe is a particular study not so compelling. And then you will get things out where it's like, this is randomized, or this is, this does seem like there's kind of something random that happened, or something that could be plausibly random that happened, which can let us learn about these effects. So not everything is terrible, but a lot of things are terrible, actually. And it's almost all for the same reason.
We've had a few questions come in around the theme of, there's a difference between academic and university publishers and trade publishers. So how did you assess publishers? How did you approach them? How did you find a good fit? And then how did you navigate contracts, agents, kind of all those things? People are interested in some of the nitty gritty of how you went about not only translating your work, but actually finding people to publish your work in the trade press.
Yeah. So when I wrote a book proposal for Expecting Better, I sort of knew that if I was going to write the book, I wanted to write it with a trade publisher, because the reach is potentially quite a bit larger. And I sent the proposal to an agent, which is usually what I would tell people is the first step. You very, very rarely does one get a contract with a trade publisher without an agent. So I said
And how did you find that agent? How did you find someone who's a good match there, that first step?
So I did not do this. I love my agent. She's great. I would not have suggested someone do it this way. I think the best way to do this is to talk to anyone else in your general academic field who has an agent who does press books. So like for academics, there's an agency called Brockman, who does a lot of, they actually do a lot of like academics publishing for popular press kind of books. So I think sort of finding someone who knows is an easy in. I had a friend who had an agent, and so I sent my book proposal to her, and I was lucky because she said that she liked it, and that was kind of it on that. And then once you have an agent and a book proposal, they like shop it out to publishers, and so you send it to a bunch of publishers, and ideally some of them want to talk to you and want to potentially buy the book. And I think those conversations often tell people are very important, I think, for academics, because you want to get a sense of how aligned is the person that is the editor you're talking to with the vision that you have, and with where you want to be in the continuum between like, this is an academic book and this is like a beach read, right? And there's like, for a lot of this kind of book, there actually is there's like many ways to put together a book that range from like, this is basically just I stapled my papers together, all the way to like, there's some smutty, like, not really, but like there's a big range that you could have.
Yeah.
And being aligned with an editor on where you're going to be in that space, are there going to be graphs? This is like a big thing for me. Like, are we going to be able to be having graphs and tables? Because I need there to be, the whole thing's not graphs and tables, but I need there to be like graphs and tables, because that's important to me. I need to be able to put a graph in with x-axes, y-axes, and bars and error bars. And like, that's the kind of book I want to be writing. I don't want one on every page, but I want some. And so in the end, that was the kind of thing I talked about with the agents. And I found my editor is the greatest in the whole world. And she is particularly great because she is a very good fit for the kind of level that I wanted to be at. And then, once you do that, and hopefully people bid for your book, and then you write it, and then you kind of go there.
So I just want to probe a little bit deeper on this question of editor, because I'm sure people have questions about that. Were you assigned someone? And it was just luck that there was such a good fit, or is there this stable of editors that the publisher has, and they say, well, try these people out and see who aligns best with you, and then what questions did you ask them to assess that fit?
Yeah. Okay. So actually, the way that this works in trade press is editors are the editor bids for your book, and so the editor, like a particular editor at like an imprint, will like decide they're interested in your project, talk to you, go and negotiate with their boss about like, what kind of do we want this book? What kind of advance would we give this person? And then they will bid on your book. So your relationship is with the editor inside some larger imprint, which would manage like the publishing pieces. And so that's like the person who's kind of most relevant for you is the editor. And if you have a good agent, your agent will know like what kinds of which editors are interested in books like this. So they'll send your book out to like a bunch of editors who sort of seem like people who would like books like your book. And then, if I were doing this again, I would know much more about what to ask. But I think the key questions that I would ask people are in this space of, how academic-y, can we be? Are you comfortable with whatever is the sort of technical piece of kind of what you're going to be doing? And then I would ask them about like, where they see the book in the market.
And then the book is ready for the market. And then could you help us all understand what pieces of the marketing did you control? What pieces of the marketing did the book do? You have a website, you have a newsletter, you have various social media presences. Was that your own agency, or was that some of that generated from the publisher, and they have this is what you'll need to do to get this out, and here are the places that we want you to be interviewed by, and kind of the talk shows we want you to be there to kind of get this out to a popular audience? How did that all work in terms of the getting your message out and your strategies or their strategies to help spread your ideas?
So most of the time, for most books, for my first book, this was true, probably for my second book too, the publisher manages all of this. So basically, like, your publisher will like help you figure out where you place the first excerpt from a book, which is often called first serial, that will go like out into like some publication. So people find out about your book. They will think about, are there people who could interview you, podcasts, TV, local radio, like whoever are the people, they will sort of coordinate that piece of it. Often your publisher will say, like, it would be great if you had a social media, like if you had an Instagram account or you had a Twitter account, if you had a TikTok account, like book talk is very big, apparently. And so they sort of will like you to do some of that stuff. The level at which I do this now is sort of pretty far beyond like what would be expected. And so at this point, I manage a lot of that stuff myself, but sort of in the early on, it's really a lot of the publisher kind of trying to figure this out and then asking you to sort of fill in some of these pieces.
We have a question that just came in that I want to go back to. It goes back to something that we talked about just a few seconds ago. You just said having research assistants pull papers on breastfeeding and synthesizing that literature was very interesting. Could you share more, some of the behind the scenes of that process of writing your books that might not be obvious to the reader?
Yeah, so I think it's always the process of writing my books is most of my books pretty straightforward. So I spend sort of for a given topic, I spend a lot of time with the literature. So, and actually having RAs do the sort of pull of paper is pretty unusual. Most of this is like, most of this I do it myself. There are a couple of these topics where like, because I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything, I had other people sort of backfill the literature. But most of the time it is me kind of doing a sort of literature review, thinking about what is in this space and what do I want to highlight and what's important in this space and sort of trying to understand the landscape. Fortunately, all these things are pretty closely related. And so sort of over time, I got much better at like already knowing a fair amount about the literature. And of course, on the data side, that's the piece of it that I am most comfortable with. So there's kind of that piece of it. And then there's the sort of next phase of figuring out, okay, how do I write this? How do I write this up? And that again has like a couple of different components. One is how am I grabbing people in this topic? So, with Expecting Better, if you sort of read that book, a lot of it is a kind of combo memoir, meta-analysis, like sort of something where like my own experience is playing an important role. And so some of that writing is thinking about like, what are the pieces of my experience or the experience of others that I want to like bring out into this that will sort of draw people into this or get them interested or resonate with them. And then how do I want to sort of present the literature? And I guess for me, that's like the most interesting challenge is how do you take this literature that now like you feel like you understand, but how do you present it in a way that makes sense to people, that they can understand, that they can have some reasonable takeaways from. And so some topics that's pretty easy and some topics it's much harder to be like, okay, this space is enormous. Like, how do I kind of walk people through it to get some from the beginning to the end? So I don't think there's anything super secret, actually.
Just on that last point, did you do any kind of, reaching out to your parent friends or other stakeholders to say like, this is what I'm thinking about and this is how I would describe it, but does this make sense to you? Or does that your editor played, or how much kind of socializing of your ideas did you do before they went into the book?
Yeah, so there's like two parts of that. So one is like on some of the sort of like, do we come to the same conclusions as like, how, like, can someone sort of help me make sure that I'm not missing something? That's where I had like actually people who were not my friends, sort of like external, like I have a medical editor, I have doctors, I have, pediatricians, like people who sort of did some medical feedback parts of it for me. But on the other side, for my first book in particular, my college roommate edited everything before it went to my editor. So I would say, before I'd write a chapter before I would like send anything to my editor, and went to Jenna, and Jenna is like a very, very smart individual who is not an economist or particularly trained in data. And so she was like really important at sometimes just coming back and being like, nothing here makes any sense. Like you got to start from scratch because I didn't understand anything. And sometimes being like, okay, or she'd be like, this is super boring. Like I read this chapter and it was super boring, like make it more interesting. And so there was sort of some of that was really, really valuable.
Right. I think as an academic, there's a pressure sometimes to make sure that your work is kind of deeply academic and for an academic audience. Did you receive any criticism or from the academic community when your non-academic writing kind of first was published? Sometimes I think the concept of public intellectual is seen as not as serious as a kind of purely academic. Did you receive any comments or criticism from Brown or
Yeah.
from your other colleagues in
Yeah,
economics?
fired. I mean, so the job that I was in at the time, and this is a more complicated story, but the job I was in at the time was I was an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. And they and I was brought up early for tenure and turned down. And I think, like, I mean, everyone on this call is an academic, and we all understand that there's a lot of reasons that people get tenure or don't get tenure, but I think it was not, the book came up occasionally, and I think it did not come up as a plus. And a lot of people ask me, I think it's a very reasonable question, actually, like, why would you do this? So I remember someone, not at my university, someone I like very much, who the first time I saw him after the book came out was like, I just got to ask you, why would you do something like that?
Huh.
And like, I don't know, I just like thought it would be fun. But I do think that it was a sufficiently weird thing to do, particularly as a junior faculty member, that I really understood those. I really understood a lot of the reactions. And I think there's just, I mean, we're doing a thing here, right? We're writing papers, and there's a metric of success, and like, publishing books about your vagina are not like, it's like in the tenure packet.
Yeah.
And I think it's reasonable for people to say, like, this doesn't, this is sort of outside of the academic space. So yes, there was certainly a lot of pushback like that.
So kind of related to this is, how do you explain the value of your public facing work to your R1 institution? This is coming in kind of from our audience just now. Is your public facing work entirely separate from your work at Brown, or have you helped your department or institution understand the value of publications that are not just peer reviewed scholarly publications?
So I think relative to there's a few things going on. So one is relative to a decade ago, I think that the sense of kind of the value of sort of reaching outside the academy has gotten somewhat greater. So I think there are more people more broadly in academia who would think of sort of public facing scholarship or doing things public facing as a kind of something of value. My particular university has been incredibly supportive of what I have done, and I think that they have found good ways for this to work in concert with what I do here, and not in conflict. So I do research, I do teaching, but this is a piece where I think there are benefits to the university as well, and I think they've been pretty great. Actually, they're great. So.
I'm very glad to hear that for you, and also for all of us who benefit from your books. So thank you for that. So another question from the audience: a lay audience may not find most economic or statistical findings super relevant to them. How do you pique the interest of a popular audience, especially for those who may be averse to academic research?
So I think this is sort of the sense in which is lucky here, because the stuff that I am talking about topically are topics that people care about. People really want to know how to do a good job with their kids. That's like people's just like main thing. And so if you're like, I've got some research that's going to help you like think about how to do a better job with your kids, or have a better experience with your partner, or like have a better pregnancy, like you don't have to sell in quite the way. I think some of what I have to sell is the idea that this approach would be helpful in those questions that you care about, or like, and I have to sort of work on not losing people, because it is true, once you get into the weeds, people can get a little frustrated, maybe a little afraid. Like, you can sort of lose people when you don't explain well. But getting people on board with the idea that like they would care about some result in this literature, I think that's not, for the stuff I work on, that part is not hard. That part's not hard.
So related to the actual topic of your many books, we have a few questions related to parenting that I'm going to ask you, if that's okay. So So what's the best bang for your buck way to spend dollars after having a baby in order to make being a new parent more manageable? Is it night nanny? Is it technology? Is it more space in your house? Is it, what's the big bang for the buck? What would you recommend?
Oof, this is tough. Definitely not a bottle warmer. That's a loser. I mean, I think, basically help. So help is the most expensive thing, but it is also the thing early on that's going to buy you the most peace of mind. And so whether that's a night nanny or help during the day or help with food or help like just some kind of help.
Another one related to parenting. What age or stage of child development is it most important for parents to be the main caregiver?
We have good data on that. I mean, there's basically, if you asked at almost any stage, like, what is the difference in outcomes for kids who have a nanny or who are in childcare or who have, a stay-at-home parent or part-time parent or whatever it is, we really don't see much in the way of sort of systematic differences across kids. If you had to say, like, maybe I would say the first 4 months, because that is the period where we have the best evidence from like the value of maternity leave. And so when you sort of, one of the things I talk a lot about is the importance of paid leave and sort of universal paid leave, and generally thinking that that should go through about 4 months. The US does not have any paid leave, which is shameful and gross. And so I think, having sort of that time, I think is pretty important. Once you start sort of pushing past that, our evidence in favor of kind of the value of a parent over other caregivers is much more limited. I would say one other thing about this, which is people ask that question a lot with the idea that the thing we're trying to get with our employment choices or our childcare choices, that the thing we're trying to get is like some optimization for our kid. That like the goal is like make our kid like the Terminator or something, like the best thing. And I actually would almost urge people to ask themselves instead something closer to like, what's the thing that we want for our family? Like what's the thing that I want? And I will say, like, sometimes you surprise yourself. So my taste for time with my kids is way higher now than it was when they were little. They don't have as much time for me, but I feel that the value I am bringing is much higher. And also just for my personal, like the value that I'm bringing to myself is much higher. And so actually, if you would ask me now, sort of looking back, I would trade time early on for time now. My kids are like 8 and 12. So I just think there's a lot of questions we could ask that are different than like, how do I make my kid the Terminator?
So just related to this, were there misperceptions that you were hoping to resolve about parenting using data, or was it more about offering people kind of a suite of options to help them figure out what might work for them? Because I think there is this pressure of like doing parenting right, and that there might be only one way of doing it. But what were you hoping to achieve, in writing your books in terms of writing or correcting misperceptions?
So I think when I wrote Expecting Better, I was hoping to correct what I thought were a lot of like garbage things that people were being told based on bad data. And so a lot of that book is, adversarial is not the word I would look for, but sort of like, here's something people told you, like bed rest might be a good idea, but actually it's not. And so there's a sort of piece of that motivation, which was around, both trying to help people work through, these decisions on their own, but also trying to surface data, which I thought in many cases pushed back against some of the kind of what we call like the conventional wisdom about pregnancy. So there's sort of a mix there. Most of the stuff after that, Crib Sheet, Family Firm, a lot of the writing I do for Parent Date actually is much more sort of recognizing that there are many good choices, and that what we need to do as parents is kind of figure out what is the right way for us to sort of put all of our choices together in a way that works for our family. And that for me was a bit of that's something I learned as I wrote Crib Sheet. So I sort of went into writing Crib Sheet with this idea that like, it's going to be just like Expecting Better. I'm going to like destroy all these conventional wisdom. There's a few things in there that have a little bit of that feel, but much more of that book as I wrote it was just like, well, actually there's a lot of like, oh, okay, that like anything is fine there. Like, here's how you would do it if you want to do it this way or that way, but really not much evidence that either thing is better, better for your kid.
Mhm.
So I think my attitude towards bossing people about their parenting has somewhat improved over time.
Has any of your advice kind of strayed into the policy space? We've got a question here about any advice for writing for an audience of policymakers versus the general public. Have you taken all of your research and you mentioned that the lack of paid leave in the United States is a real problem. Have you tried to kind of meld the economic research with your public research for policymakers?
Most frequently during COVID. So, I mean, so paid leave is one example that I've sort of tried to talk to policymakers about. That's actually not a super interesting example because everyone knows paid leave is a good idea. The problem is like, it's such a good idea that everyone wants to tack it on to things that people don't like. And then you can't, but that's like a whole other discussion. But during the pandemic, yeah, I mean, I use the platform to talk a lot about kids and schools. And a lot of that was talking to policymakers and, using a version of this platform to, collect data and to try to deliver good evidence about topics where we had very little data. Writing for policymakers is different than writing for parents. And communicating with policymakers is different because they have a lot of considerations that are going beyond like what does the data say into some other considerations. So I would say that's not my primary audience.
Another question from the audience. Has your public writing journey benefited your academic research in any way, or helped shape the academic research that you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of things in my academic work, particularly in the period like between expecting better and like crib sheet or whatever, where the way that I was thinking about the world was influenced by a lot of the examples. So be very concrete, like my most cited academic paper is a paper about selection on observables, basically, like about what happens when you control for a different variable. It's like a statistical paper. And the motivation for writing that paper was basically studies that I had looked at and expecting better. So it was sort of a paper that came very directly out of that work. So there's a fair amount of talk back and forth between the academic work and the sort of public facing stuff.
Going back to a question that I asked you earlier, there's a follow-up question on, I had mentioned you have lots of different platforms that you're on, and which channel have you found the most effective, however you want to define it, to connect with the public? Books, blogs, paid content, podcasts, workshops, something like this. What's been most effective?
I mean, my reach is biggest in the books, and it probably the sort of newsletter has changed my life the most. So like in the sense of like, it's the sort of thing that has me in the most frequent contact with a large number of people. But this all works it all works together kind of a weird way.
So another kind of question from the audience. So, how do you figure out, kind of based on your own life experience, chats with parents and other stakeholders, how do you figure out what the next thing is going to be, or do you have a path in mind after the unexpected? Is there something else?
Like, what's the next book?
Yeah, or a next area that you want to research within this discipline?
Not like much of a planner actually in that dimension. That's probably why I ended up here. I'm sort of like, each of the things that are the next step have been a result of seeing something that I thought needed the next step, and then sort of figuring out how to do it. So I don't think I have anything specific there. I mean, I tell you, like, I run Parent Data. There's a website, parentdata.org. There's a newsletter, and we are trying to figure out all the different ways we can sort of serve parents and people who want to become parents and people who are sort of older parents. Like, how can we serve people in a broader way with the general message of trying to help people make decisions with good data? So if I had to sort of say what's my core underlying value, it's that. And the question is just what are we pointing that at next?
So kind of a deeper dive into a question about writing. So when writing a full-length book, where do you begin? What's your process in terms of outlines, chapters, even, kind of your nascent idea for what what the book is going to be about?
Yeah, so I start with an outline and chapter outlines. And so basically like quite a detailed sense of like what will the structure of the book look like and what will all of the chapters be. And so that's like, yeah, like there's that. And then you kind of, there's just almost a checkbox of like just doing the just like doing the chapters. And it's very hard to write a book if you don't have a sort of clear sense up front of like what it's going to look like at the end. Of the books that I have written, the one that I struggled the most was one where like we just didn't have I didn't have quite a clear sense of like how it was going to come together, and it made it much more difficult to write. So I think I would never do this again without a super clear outline. And the other thing I will tell people before embarking on this is that some people really like this type of writing and find it interesting. Easy isn't a good word, but like just sort of like they like it. And some people hate it. And it is really important to know if you are going to like it or hate it before you embark on this. I think a lot of people end up like resenting having agreed to do some non-academic writing because it turns out they hate it. And then it's like really tough because it doesn't have the kind of rewards in the traditional like academic way that we have rewards, and you don't like doing it. So I would always tell people like, make sure that you're going to like enjoy the process of doing this before you agree to do it.
When you were talking about outlines and kind of the things that you wanted to highlight in each individual chapter, when does the editor come in? Do they start at that point to say like, well, Emily, I don't think it makes sense for you to include this here,
Totally
maybe
right.
elsewhere? Or is it
So
at the end more, like
both and more or not. So I think this is another thing which editors differ on, and it's probably good to sort of understand like how much handholding they want to do. So most editors like look at your outline at the beginning. That's like pretty common. But then like, do they see just the finished book? Do they see, sections along the way? Like that's pretty variable. Both in terms of what authors want and in terms of what editors want. I had a lot, like my editor had to do a lot of back and forth. And so like she sees a lot of things sort of as they develop because that works. Because that works for me. But we've done less over time. And I think some of this is about how much do you want them to be shaping your like writing.
So I know we have about 15 minutes left, so throw your last questions in to the Q&A if you haven't already. Emily, we've had a question come in about, are there lessons you've learned from being a CEO of Parent Data that you didn't learn from being a professor? Are there anything you'd like to share about that?
Yeah, it's really hard to manage people. So, I mean, most of the time some people like run labs, but for the like stuff that I do, like it's mostly like you're alone, or you have some RAs, and like managing RAs is kind of like, I don't know, it's not that hard. It's not that many of them. They're kids. You like kind of have a sense of how to do that. Running a company with employees is a different challenge. It's cool. It's interesting. It's fun. But they definitely do not train you to manage people in training us to be professors, which is, of course, I think the same thing people say when they move into academic administration is like, boy, now there's all these people I have to like that's what's hard. Like please return me to there are definitely days when I will spend my day like coding something, like just doing some like whatever, doing some analysis. I'm always like, this is so relaxing. but, but in the end,
Yeah.
I like the challenge is fun, but it's the people part is hard.
So kind of a segue to the next question, which is related. What are the biggest challenges of, you're an academic, you're a writer, you manage this, huge community of folks. You're a parent, you're a person unto yourself, you're a runner, like how do you balance all of those things?
So, I mean, I think one of the hardest things about being an academic as a parent, and this extends to kind of what I do now, is that it is simultaneously like intensely flexible. And so it's sort of like there's something very nice about the idea that like, I talk a lot about needing to be home with my kids, or like wanting to be home with my kids for dinner. And like that's way more accessible as an academic than it would be if I were a surgeon or a like lawyer or something, because of the way our jobs are. But you're always on. Like you can always work more. And that's true. That was true when I was just a professor. It's true now. Like there's always more things to do. There's always more stuff to finish and more papers to write, more books to write, more blog posts to write, whatever. There's always more things to do. And I think that kind of tension is something a lot of people experience in academia, particularly once you have kids. A lot of people are used to like having no work-life balance. We're working. Before my husband and I had kids, we just worked all the time. That was it. Like we're just like all the time. We like eat dinner, we work more, all the working all the time. And kids sort of force you into some kind of balance, but figuring out like what's the right balance, I think that's hard. The just feeling of not being able to really be off.
Again, related, as you've gained a higher profile, how have you navigated being a public figure around kind of privacy, maybe criticism? How have you navigated that as you've gained a higher profile?
I think you need a pretty thick, like my skin has thickened
Mm.
a lot. And if you do stuff out in the public, this is particularly true during COVID, but it's true for a
Yeah.
lot of stuff I do. Like, you do stuff out in the world and people will, will tell you that you suck and that, they'll say much worse things than that. And that sucks. Nobody likes when people tell them that they are awful, like, genocidal maybe. Like nobody likes being told that kind of stuff. It's just like nobody enjoys that. I think the best advice I got about this sort of sometime mid-pandemic, which I use all the time, was actually from a podcast. So it's from Glennon Doyle's podcast, which is great. It's called We Can Do Hard Things. And she talked about this idea of like how much of the criticism you need to take into your house, and the idea of there being like a mailbox of criticism outside of your house. And like, you don't have to take it all in, that sometimes people will say things and you just don't have to see those. You don't have to see those things or think about it. There's kinds of criticism you should take from people that you love, from people you care about or respect, but you don't actually have to take criticism from everyone else. And I think that's in some ways a somewhat gendered thing, but I think it also works. It also works for academics. Something I would urge many academics to think about, even in just their academic work, is that this can be a very evaluative environment and people can be very tough. And just thinking a little bit about, separating out your personal from your professional life, and kind of thinking about which pieces of criticism, belong inside your emotional home seems important.
So you just mentioned some advice. So maybe we can, as we wrap up, I'll ask you to provide some advice to our audience. So what's some advice that you would give to someone who's looking to write for a non-academic audience for the first time, either as a unknown entity, they might be a freshly minted PhD student or a PhD grad, or maybe even a current student, or even an academic who's just thinking about this, who's been an academic for a while. Is there different advice that you would give to someone who's a newly minted PhD versus someone who maybe has built up a reputation in their scholarly field and are thinking of making this change? What advice might you give those two groups?
I mean, I think it's really different. So I think if you're a person who like has tenure and like is looking for the next thing, the question I would have people ask is like, is this my next thing? Is it something that I enjoy? What would I get out of it? Like, but that's a much less fraught question because like you've gotten to the end of whatever is this thing. And the question is like, what's your next thing? Do you want to keep doing this thing? You want to do something a little different? I think for people who are like without a platform, without a job, and I put this assistant professor, like sort of junior faculty, graduate students in this also, I would say like, this is not the typical path. And there's a box that we expect from academic jobs. And if you move outside of the box, that is still going to be perceived as odd. Doesn't mean you don't want to do it, but I think it's really worth thinking about, like, what is the implication going to be of trying this? Now, if the question is like, how do I get someone to pay attention to me? I think the answer is like, you write things and you see how that goes. And, a lot of the early writing I did, even before the books, was, like, pieces about my research for kind of Forbes or for
Yeah.
outlets,
Mhm.
op-eds. There's like ways to get sort of your feet wet with this. But I think there's also a real caution about just thinking about, how you will reap what you sow if you make this choice, which isn't to say I don't think it's a good choice. I mean, it clearly, for me, this was exactly the right thing to do, but it is a choice.
And so we have a few of our graduate students are on this webinar as well. So is there anything that you would recommend current graduate students do now while they're here to hone their writing skills, to expand later career options? Is there anything that you would recommend they take advantage of here at Harvard, you having been here yourself for a number of years?
Like you guys have a writing center. I mean, I think having people who are not, if you want to be writing for a non-academic audience, you need to practice doing it. And and I think your writing skills as an academic will improve if you have thought about how to write for a broader audience. I actually think that we sometimes, even in our academic writing, we can hide behind jargon in a way that is not super helpful. So I think having your friends who are in other disciplines read your papers or read your writing or whatever is actually like probably the easiest way to figure out where are you being the most confusing, which is our main problem as academics. We're just confusing. We're not structured. We like say weird stuff. Like, so just trying to get like your mom, your friend who's in, chemistry, if you're in history, or a friend who's in biology, if, you're in economics, like getting people to read your stuff and tell you if they can understand it. That's always where I would start.
Great. As we wrap up, I just want to say, is there anything that you wanted to say that I didn't give you the chance to say? Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to make sure to communicate to this group?
I don't think so. I mean, I feel really lucky actually to get to talk here and to sort of get to do these multiple things that I like so much. And for me, it's been kind of I don't know, it's been a journey. Because I definitely always thought I would just be an academic and be writing papers, and this other thing is just different. And for me, I think it is kind of my highest value because it's my comparative advantage. Not to like use a lot of jargon, but I think that's it's just I just feel very lucky.
And I think your reach is so enormous. As an academic, your reach, your peers and maybe a group outside that, but kind of writing in the way that you have, you've touched hundreds of thousands of people and helped make their lives better. So just want to say thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you for having me. This was
being with
awesome.
us today.
Super fun.
It's really been wonderful. And I want to thank the audience too for great questions before we began, when you submitted them online, and also throughout this webinar. So thank you to all of you who helped to shape our discussion today. Before I end, I just, I'd be remiss if I didn't say Emily's books are available where books are sold, and her organization, parentdata.org, has a treasure trove of resources for parenting, and free and paid subscription opportunities where you can access the incredible research that she and her team has conducted to help all of us think about pregnancy, parenting, and beyond. So Emily, thank you again, and thank you to everyone, and we'll look forward to future conversations. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.